Hello, and welcome to the History Inquirer. This is where we inquire into the past, understand our present. Today, I will be continuing my series on the American Revolution by talking about the Battle of Saratoga, New York, which was a major turning point of the war. The question is, why? Why was it a turning point? How did it impact the rest of the war and the lives and careers of the key players? Who were the key players? When was it fought and why? What are the details? These are some of the questions that we'll attempt to answer in this video, in this inquiry. So kick back, relax, grab a drink, and a tricorn hat, and to tell you about the Battle of Saratoga. So the year is 1777. The British leadership decided that their goal for the campaign season would be to gain control of the Hudson River Valley and cut New England off from the rest of the colonies. Now that is a very difficult task, if not impossible, because of how large the territory is, and Woody Holton, from writing in his book, Liberty is Sweet, talks about how big of a task this was, and historians comment on this too, that even if they were to have regular patrols and multiple forts, it would still be a very difficult task. But nevertheless, the plan was to have General John Burgoyne march south from Canada, and General William Howe march north from New York City and meet in Albany, as well as British General Barry St. Leger. He would march from the west to the east, from Oswego along the Mohawk River Valley to Albany, and aid Generals Burgoyne and Howe in the attack on Albany, where the main rebel force in the north was located. However, things did not go as planned, especially since the government in London frequently issued recommendations as opposed to orders. So, yeah. And historian Woody Holton, in his book Liberty is Sweet, points this out as well. Now, on July 1st, General John Burgoyne, with 9,000 men, including 3,000 Germans, in addition to Native Americans, Loyalists, Scots, and Canadians, marched on Fort Ticonderoga. He managed to take the fort on July 5th by occupying Sugarloaf Hill and building a gun battery there, which American General Horatio Gates believed to be impossible, and suggested fortifying the nearby Mount Hope instead. Now, the problem for the Americans is that they had too few men. They couldn't maintain the defenses there. Now, Gates did eventually order the fortifying of Sugarloaf Hill, but by that time it was too late, and the Americans were driven off by the British. And with the construction of the gun battery on Sugarloaf Hill by the British, the Americans were forced to evacuate, which they did during the night of July 5th to 6th. Americans were disgusted by this because they believed and saw the evacuation as an act of cowardice, and an investigation was carried out by Congress. Now, some of the Americans managed to escape to Hubbardton, Vermont, where the rear guard fought with the British, buying time for the rest to escape. General Burgoyne then marched on Fort Edward on the Upper Hudson, where the survivors from Fort Ticonderoga fled to, and forced the evacuation of American General Philip Schuyler and his men. Schuyler was then replaced by General Horatio Gates. Now, so far, things were going well for the British. However, that would soon change when General Burgoyne sent a force of Germans, Canadians, Native Americans, and American loyalists in search of supplies, horses, wagons to solve supply issues, and he did so on August 16th. However, his men were surrounded and annihilated by a force of New Hampshire militiamen under General John Stark and Colonel Seth Warner. As a result, Burgoyne was forced to spend a month stockpiling supplies for the march to Albany, and many of his native allies left for home. Then St. Leger, who was besieging Fort Stanwix, received false information that General Benedict Arnold was headed his way with 3,000 men. Information that was spread by Arnold himself. Go figure. While a number of Arnold's men was exaggerated, he actually had 700 men. St. Leger decided to retreat and would not be on hand for the fight at Saratoga near Albany. It should be mentioned that St. Leger's retreat was not an orderly one, as the Iroquois sent messengers to his camp saying that the rebels were closer than they actually were, which led to panic and flight, a rout basically. Now, the natives and others were then able to pounce on the supplies, on the plunder. Now, so also be noted that some of the Iroquois were allied, some of the Iroquois tribes were allied with the British, supported the British. Two of them, the Oneidas and the Tuscarora, were allied to the Americans. So there's a bit of civil war going on there between the Iroquois tribes. Also, it should be noted that 5 Seneca chiefs were also killed in a raid by those natives and allied to the Americans, as well as American forces as well. So that also helped to cause the retreat of the natives, as well as the British forces under St. Leger. Anyways, moving on. Now, General William Howe, who was supposed to head up north of the Hudson, decided that he would seek fame, fortune, and glory elsewhere by taking the American capital of Philadelphia, leaving General Johnny Burgoyne on his own with 5,000 to 6,000 men against an American army on the Horatio Gates, 8,500 men. So now the Americans outnumber the British. The Americans would later be reinforced during the Battle of Saratoga to bring their total number up to 15,000 men, and by the end of the battle, to 20,000 men, vastly outnumbering the British forces. Now, General Benedict Arnold and Colonel Daniel Morgan were also there in support of the American forces, along with 500 Virginia riflemen. Now, the Americans sat on top of the high ground at Bemis Heights near Saratoga, in a well-fortified position with Colonel Daniel Morgan's riflemen hidden in the woods. The heights were covered with trees and did not offer the same advantages as Breeze Hill and Boston. The line of sight was not as good, so Benedict Arnold urged Gates to go on the offensive against the oncoming British. I mean, after all, they outnumbered them. On September 19th, Burgoyne divided his army into 3 groups to scout the American defenses and learn of any weaknesses. At Freeman's Farm, Burgoyne's center encountered a force led by Colonel Daniel Morgan, and fierce fighting ensued. By the end of the day, the British held the field with the Americans in retreat, but at the cost of 600 British soldiers to the American losses of 300. Since the British lost so many and gained only a mile of ground, the Battle of Freeman's Farm counts as a defeat, especially with reinforcements being hard to come by. Now, the British would be reinforced by 500 Hessians, and they received word that General Henry Clinton was on the way north with more, so they decided to dig in for a siege. However, unfortunately for the British, the reinforcements on General Henry Clinton would fail to arrive in time. If at all. Now, General Benedict Arnold, meanwhile, was relieved of his command after starting a furious argument with General Gates over not being mentioned in his report to Congress. On October 7th, the British tried to find a way out of the pickle that they were in by attacking the Americans on the heights, but it backfired. The British were forced to retreat, and the Americans, led by General Benedict Arnold, seized Bremen Redoubt, winning the day. And as they charged the British lines, they seized Bremen Redoubt, led by Benedict Arnold. And though Arnold was severely wounded in his leg, the Americans won the day. Now, on October 8th, the British Army tried to escape back north, but a fierce storm prevented their retreat. 2 days later, the British Army was surrounded. They were hungry. They were exhausted. Okay, and then October 17th, after much negotiation, General Burgoyne surrendered to General Horatio Gates, thus securing a massive victory for the Americans. Not only that, but because the Americans proved they could fight the British and win, France decided to enter the war as an American ally to provide military assistance and supplies. Two key figures in promoting and strengthening this alliance were Benjamin Franklin and the Marquis de Lafayette. Now, Lafayette would join the Continental Army under General Washington in July of 1777, so before the Battle of Saratoga, and served with distinction during the Battle of the Brandywine. And I'll talk more on that in the next video. Now, General Horatio Gates, with his popularity soaring after the victory, would try to replace Washington as commander-in-chief, though he would be unsuccessful. General Burgoyne would return to England in early 1778, never to receive an army command again, as were his troops, in exchange for a pledge from them to never take up arms against the United States. They were allowed to keep their weapons, while 3 armed American officers escorted them to Boston, where they boarded ships bound for England in the spring, which is really amazing when you think about it, because here you have a group of armed British prisoners escorted by 3 Americans, and they didn't try to escape back to their own lines, they didn't try to escape back to New York and continue fighting. No, they honored their pledge and returned to England. Though that wasn't all the British prisoners that went to Boston and back to England. Most of the British prisoners ended up going to Virginia, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and some died on the way due to malnutrition, exposure, and disease. Some escaped and returned to British lines, and some escaped captivity to become American citizens. Right, so it wasn't all the prisoners that were escorted to Boston. Okay. Now, as for General Benedict Arnold, his bravery and impulsiveness won the victory for the Americans. He was the hero of Saratoga. He was a great general. Before that, with Ethan Allen, he captured Fort Ticonderoga for the Americans. He instrumental in the Canadian campaign. But in this case, he was the hero of Saratoga. He won the battle for the Americans. Nevertheless, because of his character flaws, he's vain, he's impulsive, he was passed over for promotion, which did not sit well with them. Even people junior to him were promoted ahead of him. He also did not receive the glory, the recognition for his exploits during the Battle of Saratoga that, by all means, were rightfully his. And like I mentioned, that was not so well with him, and that would lead to his defecting to the British, would lead to his turning traitor. And he was also badly wounded in his left leg, which caused him to receive the post of military governor of Philadelphia. Now, this would then bring him into contact with the attractive loyalist Peggy Shippen, who would nudge him into turning traitor. He also had financial issues too, which was another factor in his turning traitor. The British offered him money in exchange for giving up West Point. More on that in a later video. Okay. And speaking of future videos, in the next one, I will cover the battles around Philadelphia, where General Washington faces off against British General William Howe. And like I mentioned earlier, I'll also talk about the Marquis de Lafayette and his exploits there. So, with all that said, thank you all for watching. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe. And I'll see you all next time on the History Inquirer. Thank you.